Welcome to Talk of the Stacks. I'm Christy Pearson with Friends of the Hennepin County Library. As the library's nonprofit partner, we raise awareness, appreciation, and financial resources for our nationally acclaimed library system. Now, for those of you joining us for the first time, Talk of the Stacks is a free lecture series with guest authors who focus on the craft of writing, as well as urgent social, economic, and global topics. Tonight, we are honored to welcome the brilliant Claudia Rankin, author of Citizen and Just Us. But first, on behalf of the library and friends, we would like to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. This land and the Dakota people belong together, and by offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Dakota sovereignty, and we aspire to hold ourselves accountable to the work of reconciliation. Thank you. Well, I would next like to recognize our sponsors who helped make this free series possible. A very special thank you to LSC Architects, Knorr Companies, US Bank, and the Star Tribune for their generous support. Well, tonight marks our first of many lively conversations throughout the fall. And just as we celebrate the return of programs like Talk of the Stacks, Hennepin County Library is once again in full swing with its own initiatives. We are particularly excited about the return of in-person homework help in late October. This free after-school tutoring program has long been a vital resource for more than 1,300 students each school year, offering drop-in sessions at several libraries across the county. Now, to our longtime friends, your generosity is truly making a difference, so thank you. And if you are not yet part of our community of library supporters, what a great time. We would like to invite you to learn more about becoming a friend through the link in the chat. Thanks so much for your consideration. Now, finally, I have just a couple of tips to help you better enjoy tonight's virtual experience. If you're interested in using captions, simply click the up arrow next to the closed captioning icon and select Show Subtitles. If you'd like to ask the author a question, click the icon marked Q&A at any time throughout the talk. Events manager Rob Gowdy will join us on screen later in the program to help facilitate the audience Q&A. And now, here to introduce tonight's special guest is Rosa Marrakeen, Vice President of the Friends Board. Rosa, welcome to Talk of the Stacks, and I hope all of you enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy, and a warm welcome to you, our library friends and patrons. I'm so happy to be here tonight for an exciting and hopefully thought-provoking conversation with the incomparable Claudia Rankin. Our author is the latest of many Talk of the Stacks guests published by Graywolf Press, our local house with a formidable national reach. In her book, Just Us, Rankin draws the reader in for an intimate and deeply personal conversation, showing us the layered history and those liminal spaces that can leave us wondering and questioning, what if our own response could be different? How would that look? It really stays with you. Well, let me introduce our esteemed guests. Tonight's moderator, Chantz Erolin, lives in Minneapolis, is a poet and an editor at Graywolf Press, where he was the inaugural Citizen Literary Fellow. Our guest of honor, Claudia Rankin, is the award-winning author of Citizen, an American Lyric, and other books including Don't Let Me Be Lonely. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, the New York Times Book Review, the New York Times Magazine, and the Washington Post. Rankin is a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets and teaches at New York University. In 2016, she received a prestigious MacArthur Fellowship. And her latest book, Just Us, An American Conversation, was hailed by Publishers Weekly as an incisive, anguished, and very frank call for Americans of all races to cultivate their empathetic imagination in order to build a better future. Tonight, we are thrilled to celebrate the paperback release of this urgent and timely work. It's my great honor to welcome moderator Chantz Erolin and esteemed guest Claudia Rankin to talk of the stacks.
Thank you so much, Rosa and Christy and everybody at the library. Claudia, I'm so glad to be here with you tonight, albeit virtually. I can't wait to talk to you, but I will, and only because I know that you're going to grace us with an incredible reading. So please take it away.
Thank you, Chantz. I was just joking that Chantz and I worked so hard on this book together, Graywolf, that his name should also be on the cover. I wanted to start the reading tonight off with a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown. I just finished talking about her book, We Will Not Cancel Us. And she writes in it, it feels like we don't know how to belong to each other, to something big and collective and decolonizing. And when I saw that in her book, I felt like, oh, that's exactly what I was thinking when I was working on Just Us. So I will start by reading the opening poem in Just Us. What does it mean to want an age-old call for change not to change, and yet also to feel bullied by the call to change? How is a call to change named shame, named penance, named chastisement? How does one say, what if, without reproach? The root of chastise is to make pure, the impossibility of that. Is that what repels and not the call for change? There is resignation in my voice when I say I feel myself slowing down, gauging like a machine the levels of my response. I remain within so sore, I think there is no other way than release. So I ask questions like I know how, in the loneliness of my questioning. What's still is true. There isn't even a tremor when one is this historied out. I could build a container to carry this being, a container to hold all. Though we were never about completeness, we were never to be whole. I stand in your considered thoughts, also broken, also unknown, extending one sentence. Here, I am here, as I've known you, as I'll never know you. I am here. Whatever is being expressed, what if? I am here, awaiting, waiting for you. In the what if, in the questions, in the conditionals, in the imperatives. What if? What if over tea? What if on our walks? What if in the long yarn of the fog? What if in the long middle of the wait? What if in the passage, in the what if that carries us each day into seasons? What if in the renewed resilience? What if in the endlessness? What if in a lifetime of conversation? What if in the clarity of consciousness? What if nothing changes? What if you are responsible to saving more than to changing? What if you're the destruction coursing through your language of savior? Is that too not fucked up? You say if other white people had not, or if it seemed like not enough, I would have. What if the repetitive call of what if is only considered repetitive when what if leaves my lips, when what if is uttered by the unheard, and what if is the cement of insistence when you insist, what if this is? What is it we want to keep conscious, to stay known? Even as we say, each in our own way, I so love, I know, I shrink, I'm asked, I'm also, I react, I smell, I feel, I think, I've been told, I remember, I see, I didn't, I thought, I felt I failed, I suspect, I was doing, I'm sure, I read, I needed, I wouldn't, I was, I should have, I felt I could have, I never, I'm sure, I ask, you say, and I say, but what is it we're telling? What is it we are wanting to know about here? What if what I want from you is new, newly made, a new sentence in response to all my questions, a swerve in our relation and the words that carry us, the care that carries. I am here without the shrug, attempting to understand how what I want and what I want from you run parallel. Justice and the openings for just us. So I think at this moment, Chantz will come back and we'll have that long awaited talk. We've been waiting to have Chantz. How's the writing going?
It's going. It's tough in the pandemic. How about you? Are there more chapters to add to the next book edition that we can work out?
Yeah, I've been working on some poems of late, so that's interesting.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think, I love that you opened with that because it just so aptly encapsulates the kind of possibility that I feel like is at the core of what you're trying to open up. And I'm so struck by specifically the line of saying, we are not about completeness. And I think of the opening up of possibility and conversation and justice as sort of a reparative act, so something that has the capacity to repair, but maybe I'm missing something there. I wonder if you could speak more to that tension between the possibility for reparation, to use that word, and then also that resistance to completeness.
Well, I think transformative justice is sort of what we're after. Reparative relationships maybe, but transformative justice. I think we have tried and tried through legislation, through marches, all kinds of things to change the way in which this culture behaves towards people of color, towards women, etc. And what we see is that it's not in the legislation, but in the people, because the people actually make up the institutions, they make up the juries, they make up the courts, they make up the police forces that enforce the laws. So no matter what the laws say, we still need the people. And so we have to believe that we can come to some place of conversation so that things can transform in ways that we haven't seen as yet.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you. My gut reaction is thinking, oh, that takes so much patience, and as somebody who spends 10 hours a day on the internet, that's something that I'm pretty alienated from. And that's, you know, two words that I've heard used a lot around Just Us, and Rosa just did, are both patient and urgent, is talking about the patience in the book and the urgency of it. And I wonder if you can say anything about that tension, or if it's something else entirely.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think we see the urgency of the need to start talking to each other. We see it. We have heard it in different ways, from Obama's call to move across the aisle to Biden's insistence that he will work with everybody in the government. But on the grassroots level, I think there is where you actually see it at work. I think in grassroots organizations, the reason they have been able to affect so much change in this country is that they have had the kind of day in and daily patience to knock on doors, to talk people into getting registered for voting, to convince people that vaccinations are the right way to go. You know, so that kind of work, unglamorous as it has always been the most important work going on.
Yeah, and you know, thinking of the human level of that, because I mean, to me, that feels maybe, if not like my bread and butter, at least like, you know, what I came out of. You know, that's how I came to poetry, was through grassroots activism and all of that. And something that I've seen a lot, that I've also seen acknowledged really candidly in Just Us, is the kind of exhaustion, just the interpersonal human exhaustion. I mean, there are literally, and this is one of my favorite parts of the book, but there are literally cries for help, you know, across many of these pieces. And I mean, I don't know, I don't want to do something as a cliche as asking for advice, but you know, what would you say to those of us who are coming into this exhaustion in a new way? You know, we're not 21 anymore. You know, how do we keep going?
Well, I think you don't keep going. I mean, I think we all take breaks, and and this is where the idea of community is so important. We have to, self-care is important, is what I'm trying to say. And if you get to the place where your effectiveness is hampered by your own exhaustion, then it's a time to take a break, with the hope that someone else can step in for that time. And I know for myself, there are times when I have stepped away and then I come back, then something else pulls me back. And I am patient with those times. I'm curious with those times, because I learn during those times. I learn sort of new ways of entering, a new language to help me move forward.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that as an introvert. I think, is, you know, needing that time away. And it makes me think too of, you know, in Citizen, something that sticks with me so much is you brought up what Judith Butler said in response to how language can be harmful. And it's in, I forget, it's, we suffer the condition of being addressed. You know, I might be butchering that in the paraphrase.
Right.
Yeah.
Our
And
accessibility leaves us open to others.
yeah, and that, you know, I think about that every time I'm revisiting the white card, when the white collector becomes, you know, unwittingly becomes the subject of the Black artist. And how do you feel that those two things live within conversation as you're approaching it in Just Us? That vulnerability to being addressed, and then kind of turning that on the other, you know, on, in this case, you know, white men, and also kind of making them the subject. How does that change the relationship to being addressable?
Well, I think the desire for a conversation is really a desire to be both seen and to see. And so an effective conversation, at least one that I feel is effective, is one where I both feel that I am vulnerable and open, and that I am open to another's vulnerability. And that can come in choice of words and what they're willing to say to me. In the case of addressing white men, there was another part of that that was a little bit outside of that dynamic. I think we are so used to having white people be considered people. And so they are rarely the subject in terms of their race or gender. So there was a self-consciousness in terms of pulling their gender and their race forward. And that was surprising to them because they are so used to walking through the world as a kind of generalized category of power, basically. But now I feel like so many, I don't know, did you see The White Lotus?
I haven't. I know a lot of people loved it. My partner, though, has just, I don't know why people care about these terrible white people.
Well,
And these...
I think what it's, I agree with him that they're not pleasant people, but the it's one of the few cases where their positionality is part of the narrative and under scrutiny within the narrative itself. And we're not used to seeing that in films. You know, we're used to seeing James Bond, and even though it's all about his whiteness and all about his power as it's connected to the British government, nobody says, oh, look at this film about this white guy who works for the, you know, it's like, look at James Bond. And so for the first time, I think White Lotus says, look at white masculinity. Look at the past that it gets. Look at white femininity. Look at woke people of color. Look at financial dynamics within rich white folks and less rich, poor black people. And so that's why I think White Lotus is probably the most interesting thing I've seen in a while.
This whole conversation was me trying to get to that point, Claudia, just to have us land there. But I hear you saying something interesting, I think, about the stakes of interpersonal drama and positionality. And I mean, I don't know, I think of a courtroom thriller, right? And at the end of the day, even if they're not lawyers, they still have their funds, or I don't even know what the terms are, but I guess what I'm hearing you saying is there's something really valuable about displaying that kind of absurdity or the banality of
or
that
the
untouchability.
Regularity of it. You know, it's been there forever, but it hasn't been a subject. It has been taken for granted, normalized to the point of representing the general population, when in fact it has distinctive characteristics and distinctive modes of privilege and distinctive lines of violence that has gone along with it.
Yeah, and that kind of representation too, I think it takes the word representation, right, which is maybe tossed around a lot in terms of media and everything, and it flips it into this place that's maybe a little bit uncomfortable or new and interesting. And you know, if I can play devil's advocate for a minute, right, as my partner's point is, how does the impetus of portraying people who are not white and you know, increasing that platform and representation, for lack of a better word, how does that live alongside White Lotus?
Well, I think it allows for a critique that has been taken for granted, that hasn't really happened. I mean, what is beneficial about that is that it's new. It's a new way of looking. And it's a new way of looking that is completely dependent on the work done by so many Black writers coming before. And so he's certainly in debt to those people in terms of this new lens. And I want that lens used everywhere, whether it's about looking at how weathering has affected Black people, or how privilege has perverted whiteness. You know, it doesn't, I don't care. It's just another group of people who call themselves American, and should be looked at as well as anybody else.
That's really helpful, and I like too that kind of that, you know, there's a asynchronous conversation going on, right? And this sort of reconstruction of whiteness, this reimagining of whiteness. And I'm not trying to make too much of a leap here back to the book, but it makes me think of the Verso fact check pages in Just Us, which, you know, I'm sure anybody who's seen the book and hardcover paperback is familiar with them, where there's, you know, statistics and notes and sources and kind of confirmations and arguments with the claims that you're making in the main text. But I think what a lot of people might not know is the way that the text and those fact check pages changed in the editorial process. But yeah, as new things were developed or delivered on the fact check side, and it was almost like a living document. How does that speak to maybe your relationship to the authority, to your own authority, when writing a book like Just Us, that evolving dialogue and that invitation of challenge?
Well, I do believe that my work has always been interested in, in quotes, real life. And bringing us back to actual facts, the facts that inform the culture, that informs the behavior of people. And so it was really important for me to have the fact check pages run as truthfully and as concurrently as possible with our times. And so, as you know, since you helped a lot with this, keeping the most relevant facts in play was part of the exercise of the book, which meant that things shifted as things changed. We did stop before COVID and the January 6th insurrection, but I hope that what's in the book anticipates those moments, because what's in the book is true to our lives. It's true. The facts are as true as we could make, determine them to be.
Yeah, I guess, and that's, I love that you bring that up, because really, some point around the Chauvin verdict, right? The Chauvin's conviction, the day of, I should say, I was down at George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, and the atmosphere, there was a relief, there was a relief, but I think it would be a stretch to call it a sense of justice, at least from my perspective. It felt very cautious, like we don't celebrate because this doesn't change anything. But there's this kind of liminal political space, this liminal emotional space in relation to this moment we're in, where, okay, Biden's here. Are we so happy that Trump's out? And I don't even really know exactly what I'm trying to ask out of that, but how do you feel Just Us carries into this moment? Or how do you hope that it lives in this moment of, in my experience at least, bewilderment?
Yeah, we're in, people ask me a lot, well, haven't things changed? Aren't you happy about the way things are going? And, we can't know what has changed until we have an accumulation of events that concretize the change. So Chauvin's indictment is one person, one moment. The question is, how lateral would that be? How forward looking, will that justice take us? And that we won't know. 10 years from now, we can look back and say that was the beginning of a change but we can only do that if we have the ability to stack up the cases where we see it happening. So, I was glad for that moment, but then we have January 6th insurrection. The fact that it was not, no one was indicted. We're still arguing about whether it should even be investigated. That is one of the biggest fails in terms of democracy in this country. And the lack of indictment, investigation, the lack of naming of involvement in terms of the Senate and different people in this country is an endorsement of white supremacy, because the people who stormed the Capitol were white supremacists, self-claimed white supremacists. And if you refuse to indict them, you refuse to indict white supremacy. And so, so we have Chauvin's conviction, and we have one of the biggest moments in terms of defiance of American democracy just being pushed under the rug. So so how much change is there really?
Right.
I don't know. We'll have to see.
Yeah, certainly some sense of acceleration, but with speaking cumulatively, thinking back to "Don't Let Me Be Lonely," right? The first American lyric, and then "Citizen" in 2014, and now to "Just Us." There's a chunk of cumulative history here that can be evidenced across the work. But I wonder, how do you feel about looking back on these other two books specifically, what they were addressing at the times that they were doing that? How that did or didn't build to Just Us, and how you kind of see that trilogy as a whole over the course of these years?
Well, I think the books recognize the role of permission, the permissiveness of the culture to some of the most violent moments in our history. And Lonely, Don't Let Me Be Lonely, and I think Citizen to some extent documented those moments. And Just Us was my first attempt to try to be in conversation with the reader in terms of a future that could look different, that could, and that look could be a personal one. But it's a real moment for me. People ask about institutional racism, and I always say, well, institutions are made up of people, and if you really have to start one at a time. There is somebody who denies the bank loan. There is somebody who looks the other way when the evidence is planted. There's always somebody, and it doesn't matter to a certain extent what the laws are. I mean, one of the things that Mitch McConnell did while Trump was doing what he was doing was to make sure that the courts were lined with conservative judges who will do the bidding of a white supremacist regime, which includes the erasure of choice for women, along with everything else. So, and we see how that's working out for us. So, it's one person at a time, and they seem to realize that. Amy Barrett seems to realize that many, in terms of what they've done to the Supreme Court in this country. So I think we need, and this is why they have come for us inside educational institutions and are trying to stop the teaching of certain books, and because there is an attempt to shut down discourse, conversation about our actual history.
I think about, you know, some of the fear, you know, at one point, you know, I said this to a white friend of mine. I said, you know, I forget what it was. I was like, man, it must be hard to be white. And they were like, it's not, don't worry about it. But I think about the kind of vulnerability and embarrassment that, you know, maybe, you know, Robin DiAngelo would call, you know, white fragility, but you mentioned in Just Us, you know, you're speaking to, you know, an artist who's challenging you in a way where you wonder if she feels about your ignorance the way that you feel in the company of white people. And, you know, excuse me, in my most angry moments, I want people to be embarrassed, right, about their ignorance. And I want people to be ashamed, right, for not having changed. And obviously, I don't think that that's the best way to feel or the most generative possible outcome. But personally, even, I wonder how much that's useful for me to feel that shame and embarrassment when I do. And I wonder how you feel about feeling those moments of vulnerability and shame and ignorance, and if that's something that can become useful or not.
Well, I think if I find them useful. I think the ability to see myself in others is also the ability to see others. And, you know, I know that there's so many experiences in this country, experiences by Black people that I could never know, just by virtue of my life. And so I know that there's much that I am working without true knowledge about. And so that gives me hope for all of us, you know, like all of us are working with a deficit. And if we can come to each other with the understanding, to quote Adrienne Marie Brown again, with the understanding that we belong to each other, that the democratic process is really a process of belonging to everyone. And then we will have empathy for what is not known. I don't have patience for people who are not interested in knowing what they don't know. But that's a different kind of conversation. I'm interested in people who are curious about their own vulnerabilities, their own blind spots, as well, you know, as much as I am curious about my own vulnerabilities and my own blind spots.
Is that curiosity something that, you know, at the moment, the prolonged moment of writing Just Us was a new sense? Did you have a new sense of feeling able to ask about possible features that maybe you didn't have in those in the earlier 2000s?
I think so. I think that writing Citizen allowed me to stand outside of my own experiences in a way. And the minute I was able to stand outside of them and see them, it became very clear that there were always two of us involved. And given that there were always two of us involved, it made me curious about talking to the other person. You know, there isn't racism without racists. And we are in management mode all the time around other people. And given that, we have some responsibility to those interactions if the other is willing to be in conversation with us. Hence, you know, because there is a moment when it is just us. It's just you and it's me. And we are going to make some choices about what we are willing to do for each other, how we are willing to be with each other, and whether or not we will recognize that we belong to each other. You know, I was just somewhere and I said to them, I'm not coming unless everybody wears masks. And then I got there and they were wearing masks and they kept saying to me, we heard you wouldn't come if we didn't wear masks, so we're wearing these from you. And I said, no, we're wearing the mask for you and for your understanding that we are in relation with each other.
Right. Right. That's you know, if you think there's, I forget, I think I'm 99% sure it was when you were talking to Eula Biss around the release of the hardcover, but and you know, I'm sure you said this other times too, or maybe people have said this, but you know, you're like, you know, I'm not going to sit down on a plane next to a neo-Nazi and try to make small talk, you know, and I'm not trying to make some big exaggerated rhetorical question here, but really, how, sincerely, how do you draw that line, you know, or how does one negotiate that line with those who are and are not apparently or readily apparently willing to belong to one another?
Well, I think, you know, I think it's one of those interesting moments in a conversation when you understand that the person is not willing really to take in what you're saying, even to have you say, you know. And the minute you get to that moment within the conversation, you realize it's no longer a conversation. It's somebody talking at you. It's somebody talking past you. And then I'm out. At that moment, I am out. Because I don't think it's my personal job. I hate that word, but you know, I'm not interested in trying to convince people who don't wish to be convinced of anything.
Mm-hmm.
But I am interested in being in conversation with people. So yeah, the minute, and sometimes it's not me who leaves. Sometimes it's the other person who's like, I don't want to talk to you because we obviously don't share anything that I'm willing to have as part of my belief system. And you know, my mode in most conversations is just to ask questions, and sometimes even the questions are untenable for that person. I don't want, you know, they don't want to hear the questions.
Well, I think this will be my last question to you, Claudia. So it'll be kind of an open one, but you know, I know you. I don't know what month or year it is, but very recently started at NYU, and you know, teaching comes up in your book of speaking to white students and you know, telling them that you know they're complex people who can hold both their privilege and their work and know that. And I know that you just judged the Academy of American Poets First Book Award, which we're really grateful to you for. And what, you know, again, this is big, but what could you say you're learning from and excited about the younger generation, whether it's newer poets and your students? You know, how do you feel that they have a impact on your thinking going forward and on the poetry that you're writing currently?
That's a great question. You know, I'm really, I feel like I'm in a position of privilege to always be in conversation with generations that are younger than myself and have not yet concretized their thinking from a position of scarcity or feeling scared about their own power, or even just jadedness, you know, that they're still curious. You know, you mentioned Eula Biss, Maggie Nelson, many of the writers that Graywolf publishes have that continual drive to ask questions, to think things through again. And so I find that with my students, and One of the things I'm working on right now is for NYU is a conference on pronouns, because that shift into a fluidity of the pronominal space is one that really interests me. And so I'm really challenged by the students' desire to be known by what they want to be known by, and how that is now changing their work. And the role of pronouns has been important throughout the history of poetry, you know, from sort of that generalized I that was standing in the modernist for everyone, to the more confessional I, to the rejection of that with the language poets. And then the sort of political lies, take back of women and people of color in the 1970s and as we move forward. So I'm really interested in that. So we're going to actually do a call for papers and look at the work of writers who are interrogating the contemporary use of pronouns in their work.
That's excellent. I wish I could ask you a dozen more questions about that and all else, but I think that in the spirit of conversation, we should invite Rob Gowdy up to facilitate the question and answer session with the audience. Claudia, I can't tell you how much I appreciated speaking with you this evening. I hope we get a chance again soon.
Oh, thanks, Chantz.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the screen, Chantz. And thank you, Claudia. Thank you both for letting us be a fly on the wall for that fascinating conversation that I think only editor and writer could have together. So we feel very lucky to have heard that tonight. I'm Rob Gowdy. I'm the events manager for Friends of the Hennepin County Library. And it's my pleasure to join the program tonight to moderate the audience Q&A. So just a reminder as we get started, if you haven't asked your question yet, please click the Q&A icon on the bottom center of the screen. And with that, let's get started. We've got a question from Earl. In The New Yorker, Katie Waldman wrote that, quote, "The technologies of whiteness, silencing, surveilling, policing, are supposed to be frictionless for the user," end quote, and how Just Us at points exposes and disrupts these technologies. Was this your intent? Who is the book for? Is it for as exposing, disrupting, or healing as an act of conversation?
That's a great question. It's obviously not frictionless, those technologies of whiteness. And the book was meant for everyone. It's a funny book because the speaker is me. It was written from my position, and as a Black woman speaking to a white audience, but and at times speaking to Black women, at other times speaking to Latinx people, sometimes speaking to white women, sometimes speaking to white men. So I actually meant it as a kind of conversation with the American public as I encountered it through them, and so there was not, each essay sort of went with whoever it was who was in front of me. And sometimes those people were white, sometimes they were Black, sometimes they were Latinx, sometimes they were women, sometimes, they were indigenous. Sometimes it didn't matter.
I'm picking up on that last answer. You're talking about what Just Us meant to you, and how you mentioned earlier what Just Us meant. And we had a comment from Chester here. He says, I recall hearing Just Us used as a description for the criminal justice system for Black people, because when you went to court or to jail, all you saw was just us. So does just us mean more than one thing to you as you write about it in the book?
Just means any way you can formulate it. One of the activities as a writer, for at least this writer, is that I'm really interested in phrases and words that morph into our culture in different ways. And the role of writing is to be able to get that phrase, just us, to move into justice, to move into the space between just us in all the ways that it can. And as much as it morphs and moves in the book, the more I feel like it has successfully done its work.
And I absolutely feel like it does through reading your brilliant and inspiring book. Sticking with words, Valandra picked up on this earlier. You used the term transformation in response to the moderator's use of the word reparations. What energy do these different words hold for you as you think about change?
Well, reparations to me can show itself through transformative justice. Rather than, people, the phrase I'm trying to move away from is reformative justice. Because I think reforming something that doesn't work doesn't help us, but transforming it does. And that transformation of the way things have failed us will allow for reparations. So they're tied together in that way. If something works differently, let's say you go into the school systems and figure out a way to fund those inner city schools that have been stripped of funding and left without books, without enough teachers, and allow those children to have the kind of education they should have. That's reparations. So that's that's the relationship for me in my mind.
Switching topics a little bit, this next question is from Maureen. How important is the setting for Just Us in terms of the United States versus other countries?
Well, I think anyone could write Just Us in any country. I think we are a world full of colonizing countries, and that has left us in relationships of power that in many cases privilege whiteness throughout. And so I think even as I focus on the world that is my world in Just Us, somebody in any other part of the United States could write the same book and address very similar and different issues. But someone in Britain could also write this book, and someone in Ghana could also write this book, and someone, in Paris could write this book. In Korea, you could write a version of this book that would work differently in terms of the who's where. It would bring in both the Chinese, the Japanese, and the US and the French in very different ways. But yes, I think this kind of investigative desire to converse with the history of a place could happen anywhere.
And while this book is so universal, you also use in the book your everyday life to illustrate your concepts and ideas. Can you talk about your decision to reveal your personal life and personal stories a little more deeply in Just Us?
Yeah. Well, in Don't Let Me Be Lonely and Citizen, both of those books came out of stories that I interviewed people to get. You know, I talked to people, they gave me their stories, and they were the formation of those books. But here I made the conscious decision that if I was going to ask people to be in conversation, then I too had to be in conversation, and that I had to show up as myself, me to you. So it was an intentional decision. It had to do with an interest in becoming vulnerable on the page, to show the ways in which I too fail. You know, somebody asked me about this, and I said to them, they said, you know, why do you want to look like you don't know on the page? And I said, you know, we don't need any more heroes. I don't need to construct an I that knows more than it does. I am a person, and this person, with all my blind spots and my desires and my vulnerabilities and my health issues and my family hopes and dreams, would also like more from this country. And you know, and this is what it looks like. Just Us is what it looks like from my vantage point.
And I hope that it makes all of us readers think about our vantage points as well. And I know it does for me. We have another question from Earl here that's picking up on your thoughts on the January 6th insurrection. If there is a refusal to indict the insurrectionists as a refusal to indict white supremacy, is it also a refusal to indict America and its history? How should we calibrate this potential outcome of this moment so as not to be hopeless about the American project?
Well, that's the question. That is the question. I mean, if Nixon can be indicted for doing what he did, if Clinton can be indicted for his indiscretions, but white supremacists are allowed to walk free and away from an attempt to overthrow one of our sacred democratic processes, then it shows us that what the country is really committed to. And it's not that we don't know that. I mean, look at the legislation put in place for voter suppression since the election. So when you take that event and then the legislation for voter suppression that has been put in place since the election, you see that the commitment is to the continuation of white supremacy in this country. And it's, you know, it's a hard pill to swallow. But it's also a reminder of what it will take. We have not shifted.
I think there's a question that just came in that is a great follow-up to your past statement. Neil says, when I speak to other white people about white culture, the responses can range from fragility to being accused of being a white supremacist. And what I've come to realize is that there doesn't seem to be a positive way forward for white people to think about what being white means in the context of an America where the right and Trump has defined whiteness as a continuation of oppression and supremacy. Is there a failure of the left progressives to help frame and define a future culture of all sorts of people that we can authentically feel a part of?
Well, I think this is the problem. I think we have a country that is committed to the very thing that it knows it needs to defeat. And that is complicated. You know, it is complicated. If Black people had stormed the Capitol, they would be dead and in jail. White America is clear about that. But it has a complicated relationship to its own supremacy. And until it can figure that out, we're not gonna you know, be able to change fundamentally.
It's going to take a big step.
It's going to take a big step. That's a good way, a big step.
I think we have time for one more question, but before we do, I just want to say, if you have not read Just Us yet, and you absolutely should, it's now out in paperback. And we'd really love it if you would consider purchasing it through independent bookseller Majors and Quinn. I'll be dropping a link in the chat to them in just a moment. We love it when you purchase locally because it means you're helping our local literary community to thrive. So purchase locally and definitely get Just Us. So we've got a final question from Steve. He says, I'm watching this with my publishing class and we have a question. You said that grassroots efforts to help change individuals' minds are the most important, but politicians and Supreme Court justices are a roadblock that's not going away. How do you deal with that frustration?
How do I deal with that frustration? It stays a frustration. It stays a frustration, but not the kind of frustration that allows me not to want what I want. And consequently, we have to just keep going. You know, it's sort of like climate change. You know things are bad and you do what you can. You don't just say, okay, it is, because, you know, we are here. We are here. And as long as we are here, we will keep fighting. We will keep informing. We will keep having conversations. And I just want to thank Friends of the Library. I want to thank Talk of the Stacks and Graywolf Press for keeping the conversations going, for allowing us to ask questions and even virtually bringing us together to have these back and forth. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Claudia, thank you. You've just been an inspiration tonight and always. It's just such an honor to have you with us. So thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Stay safe.
Yeah. I also want to, before we shut down, I want to thank Chantz Erolin again for leading us in that fascinating conversation. And just one more thought, if you enjoyed tonight's program and you want to help support Hennepin County Libraries and transformative programs like Homework Help, you can click the link in the chat. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight and have a great evening. Read Just Us.